Coming home from work 3 hours early, I hid inside my walk-in closet with the intention of pulling a harmless prank on my husband. Unexpectedly, I ended up watching him walk into our bedroom, wrapping his arms around my sister-in-law. I smiled coldly. "You guys love putting on a show, right? Let me be the director of this little performance for you." There are seemingly trivial jokes that end up becoming the exact moments that strip away all the most bitter truths in life. And I, a woman who had lived nearly half my life, never expected that just because of a childish idea, I would see the true face of the husband I had loved deeply for years. That day, I got off work 3 hours earlier than usual. The power at my corporate office had suddenly gone out, so all the employees were allowed to head home early. As I walked out of the office building, my heart felt incredibly light. It had been a long time since I had an afternoon this free. Suddenly, I thought of surprising my husband. On the way home, I stopped by Whole Foods to buy some fresh salmon to make pan-seared salmon, Brian's absolute favorite. My husband. I also picked out some fresh asparagus and a little steak. I imagined cooking a genuinely delicious dinner. We would sit down and eat together warmly. In my mind at that moment, there were only simple, happy images. Brian would be surprised, he would smile, and then maybe he would hug me just like when we were newlyweds. But I never could have guessed. When I arrived home, I found the front door unlocked. Walking in, the house felt completely silent. I figured my husband wasn't home yet, and my mother-in-law was out. A silly idea popped into my head, something very childish. I wanted to hide, wait for Brian to come upstairs, and then jump out to scare him. Just like I used to do when we first got married, he would get so startled he would almost drop his phone. Just picturing it made me smile to myself. I quietly slipped into the master bedroom, opened the door to the walk-in closet, and stepped inside. The enclosed space and the familiar scent of our clothes made me feel a bit giddy. I told myself to just wait a minute. Brian would surely be home soon. But I never expected that the person walking into that room wouldn't just be my husband. I had barely closed the closet door and hadn't even caught my breath when I heard the sound of the front door opening, followed by footsteps and a voice I could not mistake. The sound of high heels clicking against the hardwood floor echoed clearly in the quiet house. My heart suddenly started racing. A terrible premonition crept in. I held my breath, pressing my body against the back wall of the closet, not daring to move an inch. The bedroom door opened, and then I heard the voice of a woman I knew all too well. Chloe, my sister-in-law. I had not even processed what was happening when I heard their footsteps moving closer to the bed. And then came a sight that, even now when I recall it, makes my chest tighten. My husband Brian walked into the room with Chloe. They kept absolutely no distance between them. It was not the relationship of a brother and sister-in-law that they had always displayed in front of me. They were holding each other. It was an embrace so natural, so intimate, without the slightest hint of awkwardness. I stood frozen inside the closet. My entire body felt like ice. My ears were ringing, but every single word they spoke sounded incredibly clear and sharp. Chloe rested her head on my husband's shoulder. Her voice was soft, but every word pierced through me. "Living with Austin feels so suffocating, Brian. Only when I am near you can I finally breathe." That voice was no longer the voice of the fragile sister-in-law I thought I knew. That voice was whiny, needy, and so intimate it made me shudder. My husband did not push her away. Instead, he stroked Chloe's hair. His voice softened as he coaxed her. "I told you. Just leave everything to me. Do not overthink it, just leave it all to me." A phrase he used to say to me so often was now being used to soothe my own brother-in-law's wife. I did not feel anything anymore. There was no anger, no agonizing pain like people might imagine. There was only an absolute void. A cold, freezing emptiness. I stood in the closet. Both my hands were clenched tight. My fingernails dug deep into my palms without me feeling any pain. I only felt that everything I had in my life, in this family, was shattering into pieces. They kept talking. Low whispers, quiet laughter, all of it feeling like knife blades slicing through my heart. I did not step out. I did not scream. I did not cry. Somehow, at that exact moment, I actually laughed. A very quiet, faint laugh. But it was so cold that even I felt unfamiliar to myself. Only one thought was in my head. So it has been like this all along, and I am the very last person to know. Then another thought emerged. Not pain, but pure clarity. I asked myself what I would achieve if I stepped out right now. Throw a fit, cry, or beg for an explanation? No. I refused to be that kind of pathetic woman. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heartbeat. I remained completely silent in the darkness of the closet. listening to everything, recording every word, every tone of their voices in my mind. Then I smiled. This time, it was not an unconscious smile, but a calculating one. Alright, since you guys love putting on a play behind my back, let me produce an even bigger show for you. I do not know how long I stood there. All I know is that when they finally left the room and the door clicked shut, I slowly opened the closet door. The room looked exactly the same as when I had entered it. Only, the woman stepping out of that closet was no longer the same woman from a few hours ago. I smoothed out my hair, fixed my clothes, and looked in the mirror. My face looked completely normal. No one could ever tell what had just happened. I walked out of the room, went down to the kitchen, and placed the Whole Foods grocery bags on the granite island. Everything was still so neat. This house was still so familiar, only my heart had completely changed. I did not want to ask questions anymore. I did not want to believe anymore. I only had one thing to do, which was to make them pay, not with tears, but with the very drama they had started. And this time, I would be the one writing the script. I stood in the kitchen for a very long time that day. My hands rested on the grocery bags I had not yet unpacked. The salmon I bought for dinner sat quietly in its plastic wrapping. The asparagus was still damp from the produce aisle. Everything in front of me was exactly as it had been. Only my heart was irrevocably altered. And in that exact moment of standing frozen, the events of the last few years suddenly flashed through my mind with absolute clarity. Every face, every word, every time I calmed myself down by saying it was probably just my imagination. I had been married to Brian for exactly 5 years. Compared to many, our wedding was not overly extravagant, but from the outside, we were what you would call comfortably middle class. He worked as a regional supplier for a construction materials company, while I was an accountant at a private firm. I managed most of the money in the house. From our combined salaries to large and small expenses, I was the one who tracked, calculated, and budgeted everything. Brian used to tell people that he let his wife handle the money so it stayed safe because he was a big spender. Every time I heard that, my heart felt warm. I thought my husband trusted me. That was why he handed everything over. My husband's family was not large. His father had passed away a long time ago. At home, there was only his mother, Eleanor. Brian was the oldest son. Then there was his younger brother, Austin. Austin was 4 years younger than Brian and his personality was completely different. While Brian always appeared calm, quiet, and patient on the outside, Austin was impulsive, did whatever he wanted, lived with no rules, and refused to be tied down. From the time I first became his sister-in-law, I saw that Austin was not a man who took his career seriously. He changed jobs like he changed clothes. One day he worked in distribution sales. A few months later, I heard he pitched in with some buddies to open a local bar and coffee shop. Not long after, the place went under. Nobody knew how much money he actually made. What was clear was that he always dressed sharply. He always had the newest iPhone. If his friends called him out for drinks day or night, he was out the door instantly. There were months when Austin did not give his mother a single dime, but he loved showing off in front of others, protecting his ego, and craving praise. My mother-in-law spoiled her youngest son blindly. She would often say that Austin just had not caught a lucky break yet, that he had not found his path, even though he was the smartest one in the family. Hearing it constantly made me used to it. In this house, whatever Austin did, right or wrong, there was always an excuse to defend him. At the time, I just felt annoyed and did not think much of it. Only later did I understand that this blind coddling was what destroyed the entire foundation of this family. About a year after I married Brian, Austin brought Chloe home to introduce her. Chloe looked very young at the time, with fair skin, delicate features, a soft voice, and a polite, deferential manner toward everyone. She worked at a cosmetics counter at the mall, and her family did not have much money. So when she first came around, everyone assumed she was a sweet, easygoing girl. I thought so myself back then. I actually felt sorry for her because marrying a guy like Austin would surely bring her misery later on. And sure enough, Chloe's life after marriage was not as peaceful as one might hope. Austin, who loved messing around, also possessed a bizarrely jealous nature. His jealousy did not stem from deep love, but rather from viewing his wife as his personal property. He loved to control, loved to flex his authority, and loved forcing others to obey him. Austin could snatch and search Chloe's phone at any given moment. He read all her texts with her friends, male or female. One day during dinner, simply because he saw his wife smiling while texting back, Austin ripped the phone from her hands, slammed it on the dining table, and yelled, demanding to know who she was smiling at and accusing her of acting like a flirt when she already had a husband. Chloe could only look down, whispering that she was just texting a coworker. But Austin never wanted to listen. The more Chloe explained, the angrier Austin got. My mother-in-law, sitting right there, did not scold her son at all. Instead, she sighed and said that a married woman should know her place and avoid making her husband angry. Hearing that sentence made my throat tighten. But because this was my brother-in-law's marriage, I could not interfere too much. One time, things got much worse. That day, Chloe came home 15 minutes late because her store was doing end-of-the-month inventory. She had barely pulled into the driveway and put her car in park when Austin stormed out of the house, yanked her out, slapped her, and started screaming at her in front of the whole neighborhood. He shouted, asking where she had been and accusing her of being out with another man. Chloe was sobbing, trembling as she explained that her manager had kept her late to count stock. But Austin did not believe her. He grabbed her phone and smashed it onto the driveway pavement until it shattered. Standing by the kitchen door, I watched the whole thing and felt a chill run through my entire body. However, my mother-in-law just ran outside, pulled Austin's arm, and told him to go inside before the neighbors heard, saying they should settle it indoors. There was absolutely no reprimand about what was right or wrong. From that point on, Chloe started complaining frequently to my mother-in-law. One day, while I was cooking, I heard her crying in the living room, saying that living with Austin was like walking on eggshells, that coming home even a minute late led to interrogations and suspicion. My mother-in-law just waved her hand dismissively. She said men were just like that, they had hard temperaments, and women had to be patient and soft for a marriage to be peaceful. And just like that, all of Chloe's grievances were treated as normal occurrences. No one genuinely defended her. No one forced Austin to change. From then on, Chloe changed her tactics. She stopped seeking out my mother-in-law and turned to Brian instead. At first, it was just small things that easily made people feel pity. Sometimes she asked Brian to drive her to run an errand because she was scared Austin was in a bad mood. Sometimes she would stand by the driveway, calling Brian outside just to vent, saying he was the only one in the house who would listen to her. One day, I saw her sitting on the backyard patio with swollen eyes. Brian stood next to her, speaking softly, telling her to take it easy and that he would talk to Austin slowly. Honestly, when I first saw things like that, I was not suspicious at all. On the contrary, I felt my husband was a good man. I used to think that in a house where everyone either took sides or did not care, only Brian was willing to stand up for his sister-in-law. That was a good thing. I even told him once not to get too involved or Austin would get offended. Brian turned to me with a gentle smile, saying he just felt bad seeing her suffer, and that nobody actually wanted to get involved in other people's marriages. Yes, that day, I believed him. I believed my husband was just an empathetic person. I believed Chloe was just a miserable, desperate girl, looking for a temporary shoulder to lean on in her in-laws' home. I believed their conversations were purely out of sympathy. And because I trusted too much, I failed to see something massive growing right in front of my eyes. Looking back now, I realize that danger does not strike like lightning out of a clear blue sky. It does not come from a massive collision. It comes from the moments people allow themselves to step over a tiny boundary, and then another. Until eventually, everything has gone too far, and no one is fully conscious enough to stop. Meanwhile, I was still naive, thinking it was just pity. Without realizing it, I was nurturing a threat right inside my own home. Something that begins with the word pity can very easily slip into something else entirely. Especially when the people involved intentionally let it slip without anyone trying to pull it back. After the phase where Chloe constantly sought Brian out to vent, the atmosphere in our house began to shift in a way that was hard to explain. At a glance, an outsider would think this was a perfectly normal American family. But as someone living inside it, I could feel it little by little. The line between right and wrong was fading. At first, it was just text messages coming in at night. We would be eating dinner or getting ready for bed. Brian's phone screen would light up constantly. He would pick it up, frown slightly, and then take his phone out to the balcony or the backyard. Initially, he still told me casually that Chloe was texting, probably fighting with Austin again. Hearing that, I did not mind because in my head, she was just looking for her brother-in-law to vent so she would not feel so overwhelmed. One time, I accidentally saw a few lines of a text pop up on Brian's phone screen while it was resting on the table. It was just a glance, but enough for me to read. Austin is getting paranoid again. I am so exhausted. Then another message followed. I do not know who else to talk to. At that time, I truly felt sorry for her. A young woman married to a jealous husband, interrogated daily with no one defending her at home. If she reached out to her brother-in-law just to lighten the load on her heart, it was not crossing the line yet. But the messages became more frequent. At first, it was every few days, eventually, it was almost every night. Brian, who initially only sent short replies, started spending more and more time on his phone. One day, while I was clearing the dining table, I called him 2 or 3 times to come eat. But he remained sitting in the living room. His eyes were glued to the screen, his fingers typing away. When I reminded him, he just said to go ahead and eat first, that he needed to reply to a text real quick because she was having a breakdown. Once or twice might have been fine, but as it kept repeating, my heart began to feel uneasy. Then, from texting, they moved to phone calls. One night, close to 11 o'clock, I was just about to drift off to sleep when I heard his phone buzz. Brian immediately sat up, looked at the screen, and walked out of the bedroom. Lying in bed, I could hear his low voice out in the hallway. I could not make out exactly what he was saying, just faint murmurs. Yes, I know. Stop crying. Just try to calm down. That night, he came back to bed much later. I lay facing the wall, feeling a knot forming in my stomach. I started paying closer attention. And the more I noticed, the more I saw Brian spending far more time on Chloe than a brother-in-law ever should. One Sunday, after I finished cooking lunch, I called him repeatedly but got no answer. When I brought the food to the table, I realized he was standing at the edge of the driveway, talking to Chloe. They talked for so long that I had to reheat the soup I had prepared a second time. When I asked him about it, Brian just gave a brief answer. He said she was having issues with Austin and he was just listening to her talk for a bit. After that, he acted as if I had just asked about something entirely trivial. The breaking point was one afternoon when Austin came home drunk. Chloe showed up at our house with puffy eyes, messy hair, and a pale face. She walked in, sat on our sofa, and sobbed uncontrollably. I was washing vegetables in the kitchen, heard the crying, and immediately came out. I saw Brian already sitting next to her. Chloe was explaining how Austin had checked her purse, searched her phone, and screamed at her. As she told the story, she leaned her body closer and closer to Brian. Her voice grew soft, her hands constantly wiping away tears. I stood frozen, my heart feeling incredibly uneasy. Not because a sister-in-law came over crying, but because the way she was sitting was so close to my husband that their knees were almost touching. And Brian did not seem to think anything was weird about it at all. He poured her a glass of water and handed her tissues directly into her hand. When I gently tried to offer a suggestion, using just one sentence, asking Chloe to sit back a little bit, so the neighbors would not get the wrong idea if they looked through the window, Brian whipped his head around and snapped at me. His voice was so cold and irritated it left me speechless. He asked if I was blind to her suffering, and how I could be so heartless as a sister-in-law. That sentence felt like a bucket of ice water thrown directly in my face. I stood frozen between shock and heartbreak. Since when did a perfectly normal boundary check from me get labeled as cruel and petty? I had not even managed to reply before my mother-in-law walked in from outside. Without knowing what was going on, she immediately defended Chloe. She said if Chloe did not look for her older brother-in-law, who else would she look for? And accused me of having a dirty mind. She said there were problems in the family and instead of calming things down, I was making a sour face. And just like that, in one afternoon, I went from feeling uncomfortable about my husband's behavior to being branded as a narrow-minded, selfish person. Meanwhile, Chloe, whose actions were increasingly crossing boundaries, became the poor victim who needed protecting. She sat there, eyes still puffy, lips pressed together, looking at me with a weak, agonizing gaze. If I were not the one standing in the middle of that house, I might have believed she was entirely innocent myself. From that day on, I started feeling alienated in my own home. Every time Chloe appeared, the vibe changed. All it took was me frowning slightly or staying quiet for too long for my mother-in-law to make passive-aggressive remarks about me making things difficult for my sister-in-law. And Brian grew increasingly impatient with me. One time, I simply asked Brian what was going on with Chloe lately that she had to call so often. He snapped back immediately, telling me not to blow things out of proportion, that she was already suffering and I should not make it worse. That sentence made me choke up. Obviously, Chloe was not the only one feeling uncomfortable. I was his wife. I lived in this house too. I had feelings. I had pride. But somehow, my feelings had become completely irrelevant. As long as Chloe cried, as long as Chloe complained, everyone would take her side. Meanwhile, one word of caution from me made me a petty, ungrateful woman. Then, an incident happened that made it impossible for me to lie to myself anymore. That day, I came home from work a little early. Barely stepping through the back door, I heard whispers coming from the side yard. I intended to head straight to the kitchen, but my eyes caught Brian standing with his back to me. Chloe was standing facing him. They were talking very quietly. Before I could step any closer, I saw Chloe's hand reach out and touch Brian's hand. It was not an accidental brush, it was a very deliberate grasp. I stopped dead in my tracks. At that exact moment, Brian turned and saw me. He looked startled and quickly pulled his hand away. Chloe also let go, then just looked down as if nothing had happened. My heart was pounding violently. I walked closer, looked at both of them, and asked in the calmest voice possible, even though my inside was a total wreck, what they were doing. Brian answered first, very fast and very brief. He said she was just upset about her marriage and he was giving her advice. That was it, no further explanation. He did not meet my eyes for more than a second. Meanwhile, Chloe looked up with a faint smile. A smile that looked innocent but sent a cold chill down my spine. She said softly for me not to misunderstand, that she only viewed Brian as a pillar of support. A sentence that sounded reasonable, but for some reason, hearing it gave me goosebumps. What kind of pillar of support requires holding hands? What kind of pillar of support do you seek out late at night? Texting incessantly until my husband abandons his dinner. I wanted to confront them directly, but I swallowed it down. I looked at Brian. He avoided my gaze. I looked at Chloe. She looked down. Her face still looked as naive as ever. And as usual, I told myself that maybe they had not crossed the line yet. Maybe this was just a blurred line between sympathy and closeness. Maybe I was just overly sensitive because I had seen too many bad things in a short time. But no matter how hard I tried to calm myself, I could not deny one thing. From that day on, my heart was genuinely restless. I had once hoped the anxiety in my heart was temporary. That everything would settle down when Austin stopped being so emotional. When Chloe learned how to maintain distance. When Brian understood what made me uncomfortable. But life does not always go the way we hope. There are things that, once they cross that first boundary, will not stop, but will keep pushing forward little by little until even the people watching no longer know where the boundary is. After I saw Chloe holding Brian's hand in the side yard, the situation at home did not improve like I hoped. It got more suffocating. Austin seemed to lose control completely. He did not just check his wife's phone, he started monitoring her like an inmate. One time, while walking past their living room, I saw a small Ring indoor camera installed in the corner. Initially, I thought it was for security, but I later overheard that it was installed specifically to monitor Chloe. Where she went, what she did, and who she talked to while at home. From then on, Chloe had even more excuses to come over to our house. Sometimes she said her house was too suffocating, that she was scared to even breathe without being suspected. Sometimes she said Austin was raging again after checking the camera footage. She could not take it, so she had to come here to calm down. At first, my mother-in-law paid some lip service. She would tell Chloe to settle her marital issues at home and stop running back and forth. But despite saying that, she still let Chloe come over. And Brian was always ready to welcome her. He would tell his mom to let her be, to let her find some peace here. Over time, Chloe's presence in our house became entirely normal. And when something becomes normal, it gets much easier for people to ignore the abnormalities. One night, I had just finished cooking and walked into the living room. I saw Chloe already sitting there, hugging a throw pillow with a gloomy face. Brian was sitting right next to her. His body was leaning toward her, asking her questions in a low voice. I walked in and they were not startled, nor did they feel the need to adjust their positions. It was that natural attitude that made me the most uncomfortable. Then one day, right in front of my face, Chloe started acting entirely out of line without even trying to hide it. That evening, the whole family was watching TV after dinner. I had just walked out of the kitchen and saw Chloe sitting incredibly close to Brian. So close there was almost zero space between them. When a jump scare happened on TV, Chloe actually rested her head on Brian's shoulder as if it were a standard reflex. Brian did not pull away. He just smiled slightly and said she shouldn't get so easily scared. My entire body went rigid. I stood there for a few seconds, unable to believe what I was seeing. If I wasn't standing right there, who knew how far their natural behavior would go? I set my glass down on the coffee table, a little harder than usual. The sound of the glass hitting the table made them both turn. Chloe immediately sat up straight, but her face showed absolutely no shame. Meanwhile, Brian looked at me with an annoyed expression, as if I were the one ruining the vibe, not them. I tried to keep my voice as steady as possible, simply saying very quietly, asking Chloe to please sit a bit more appropriately. I did not yell. I did not curse. I was not sarcastic. That one sentence of correction was the result of incredible restraint. But Chloe just looked at me with a wounded expression, then replied softly that she was already living under so much pressure, and asked me not to make things harder for her. Hearing that, I almost laughed. She was leaning on my husband, practically glued to him in front of my face, but I was the one making it hard. Before I could even speak, Brian turned and reprimanded me directly. He said I was crossing a line, that she was already suffering and I was still pushing her. His voice wasn't loud, but it was cold enough to freeze me in place. I stared at him, thinking I had misheard. The one glued to the sister-in-law was not me. The one letting the sister-in-law rest on his shoulder was not me. But with just one comment, I became the household bully. I don't know since when right and wrong got twisted so severely. My mother-in-law, hearing the commotion, walked out of the kitchen without asking what happened. The moment she saw Chloe's teary eyes, she clicked her tongue and told me to look at Chloe, saying Chloe was better than me, that she had endured so much, and asked what more I wanted. That sentence was like a sweet but agonizing sword slash. I stood in the middle of the living room. In front of me was my husband. Beside me, my mother-in-law. Across from me, my sister-in-law. And suddenly, I felt so entirely alone, like a stranger. Never had I felt the isolation in my own home so vividly. From that day on, Chloe got worse. She no longer acted shy like before. Every time she came over, she immediately sat next to Brian as if it were routine. Her mouth was always complaining about her suspicious, controlling husband who made it hard for her to breathe. Every sentence was wrapped in a fragile facade. But the more I listened, the more I felt that this fragility was incredibly cunning. She knew exactly when and upon whom to depend. And Brian, I don't know since when he stopped being just a sympathetic brother-in-law and started openly taking her side. Then the exact thing I feared most, even though back then, I didn't dare give it a clear name. One night, almost 10 o'clock, there was a loud pounding on the front door. Austin burst into the house drunk, his eyes bloodshot, his clothes disheveled. As soon as he saw Chloe sitting in the living room, he lunged forward, grabbing his wife's arm and yanking her to her feet. The whole house turned into chaos. Chloe screamed in pain. Brian immediately stepped forward, holding Austin back and shouting at him, asking him what the hell he was doing, and telling him to talk things out calmly. Austin slapped his brother's hands away, pointed right in Chloe's face, and cursed her out. He asked if she was here to vent or to fool around, asking if she thought he was an idiot. That sentence sent shivers down my spine. Not because of the foul language, but because for the first time, the thing I only dared to suspect in my heart was blurted out by someone else. At that moment, I clearly saw Brian's face tense up, while Chloe immediately covered her face and sobbed hysterically. My mother-in-law ran in to break it up, scolding Austin for causing a scene late at night. After a long shouting match, Austin managed to drag Chloe home. But the story didn't end there. The next morning, Chloe came back looking even more pathetic. Her wrists were bruised, her eyes swollen, her voice hoarse. She sat in front of Brian and cried, saying she was beaten last night, accused of insane things, and called every name in the book. As she told the story, she kept staring at Brian as if he were her only savior. I sat next to her, but felt as if I didn't exist. Because the way Brian looked at Chloe at that moment was entirely different. It was no longer a look of pity, no longer the fleeting tenderness of a man defending the weak. It was something deeper, heavier, more dangerous. Something that, just by looking at it, was enough to make anyone realize the boundaries were gone. And it was exactly at that moment I began to understand something I had intentionally tried not to understand before. Pity. If placed in the wrong spot, if left for too long, if nurtured by one person and deliberately exploited by another, it becomes the most beautiful excuse for a betrayal. After seeing the look in Brian's eyes toward Chloe that night, my heart was no longer just anxious. That feeling turned into a heavy burden, like a boulder pressing on my chest. I didn't say it out loud, nor did I cause a scene. But from that day on, I started paying much closer attention to everything in the house, especially the finances. I was used to managing the main expenses, the utility bills, the groceries, and our joint savings account. Almost every month, I tracked it in detail. There are things that, in happy times, we consider trust, but when the heart is already cracked, those numbers are the first things to reveal the truth. It was the end of the month. As usual, I sat down to review the family budget spreadsheet. At first, it was just a habit because I always checked the bank accounts at the end of the month. But when I opened the Chase mobile banking app, I froze. The balance in our joint savings account was vastly lower than I remembered. It wasn't a discrepancy of a few $100 from minor spending. It was a massive amount. Enough to make anyone drop their jaw. I thought I remembered it wrong. I even tried to calm down. Maybe there was a huge expense this month that I forgot to log. But the more I looked at my spreadsheet and compared it to the transaction history, the colder I felt. It was real. A massive sum of money had been withdrawn just 3 days ago. And what made my hands start shaking was the memo attached to the transfer. It was a very short sentence. Startup capital. I sat frozen in front of my phone screen. Startup capital, for who? In my mind at that moment, I didn't even need to guess. I clicked to view the recipient details. The account holder's name appeared clearly, not a single letter missing. Chloe. I stared at that name for a very long time until my eyes burned without blinking. My fingers felt like ice. So it wasn't just text messages, long stares, sitting close together, or excessive defending. It turned out there was also money between them. And once money gets involved, it's no longer just pity. No man, purely out of pity for his sister-in-law, secretly pulls a massive chunk of cash from a joint savings account to give to her without saying a single word to his wife. I sat silently for a few minutes, then stood up and walked straight to the master bedroom. Brian had just gotten home from work and was changing his clothes. Seeing me walk in with an unusual expression, he actually asked casually what was wrong. Why did that casual attitude make me feel so sick? I held up my phone, shoved it right in his face, pointed at the transaction I just checked, and asked directly, "What is the meaning of this?" Brian glanced at the screen. I saw it clearly. His eyes stopped for a second, but just a split second later, he regained his composure. His voice was flat, as if discussing something trivial. He said he just transferred a little money to Chloe so she could put down a deposit on her own apartment to get away from Austin for a while. I listened to him until my throat choked up. A massive amount of money from our joint account, and out of his mouth, it was just a little. I tried to keep my voice from shaking. I asked again, "You transferred that much money without speaking to me at all?" At this point, Brian's expression began to shift. His earlier calm disappeared, replaced by the usual irritation that flared up whenever I touched on something he didn't want to explain. He yanked a drawer open roughly, grabbed a shirt, and snapped, asking why it needed to be discussed, saying she was his sister-in-law and she was in trouble, so he helped out a little. I looked straight into my husband's face for the first time, not looking away. Helped out a little, or helped out so often it became a habit? The atmosphere in the bedroom felt suffocatingly tense. Brian turned around, his eyes darkening. I didn't stop. I asked the question I had buried for so long. "Explain it to me, Brian. Do you consider her your sister-in-law, or what?" The question had barely left my lips and the whole room felt suffocated. Brian froze, his face darkened, his voice rose. He asked what the hell I was talking about. I answered immediately, no longer holding back. I said I was talking about what I was seeing. What he considered her all this time, he knew best. For the first time in a long time, my eyes weren't wet. There was only a creeping cold. Right at that moment, Chloe walked in from the hallway. Maybe she heard the commotion and had been standing in the doorway the whole time. She didn't look confused like someone whose name was brought up out of nowhere. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her back straight, staring at me for a very long time. In her gaze, there was no longer the weakness or pity she usually projected. She didn't say a word, but that look was enough to make me understand. She wasn't afraid. Deep down in that gaze, there was a challenge. My mother-in-law, hearing the argument, also ran into the room. She barely managed to ask what was going on before Brian cut her off. His voice was irritated. He said I was being paranoid again, that I was acting like I caught him red-handed just because he helped Chloe out with a little cash. Hearing that, Eleanor, without needing to know right from wrong, glared at me. She asked what my problem was this time, saying family members should be allowed to help each other out. I turned to look at her, my heart full of bitterness. Help her how, Eleanor? A huge chunk of our joint savings was withdrawn. As his wife, I was never informed. Eleanor immediately waved her hand dismissively, her voice sharp. She said it was money from my husband's hard work. And if he wanted to help his family, what was the harm? She called me jealous and disrespectful, saying it was no wonder the house was never peaceful. I stared at her without blinking. So in her eyes, I was the crazy one. Meanwhile, her son secretly wiring money to his sister-in-law was completely normal. Never had I felt so explicitly humiliated. The tension was at its peak when suddenly, from outside, we heard the sound of a truck pulling into the driveway abruptly, followed by rushed footsteps. Austin barged into the room. His face was beet red, his eyes bulging like a cornered animal. He pointed straight at Chloe. His voice was hoarse with rage. "What the hell are you doing here? You think I don't know? You can fool around with anyone, but my own flesh and blood brother? What do you take me for?" The whole house went dead silent. Even I didn't expect Austin to show up exactly then, let alone speak so bluntly. Chloe's face went totally pale, but what hurt me more was Brian's reaction. He didn't side with the truth, didn't panic or back away like someone falsely accused. Instead, he stepped forward, stood in front of Chloe to protect her, and shoved Austin hard. His voice was full of fury. "Don't cross the line, Austin. If you have a problem, let's talk it out like men." I stood there, watching my husband's hands protect his sister-in-law, while his own brother was shoved away, like an intruder. At that exact moment, all the remaining illusions I had shattered into dust. If there was only pity between them, Brian wouldn't have reacted instinctively like that. If his hands were clean, he wouldn't have chosen to protect Chloe first. And if this was all just a misunderstanding, I wouldn't be standing in that room feeling like a total stranger in my own marriage. The argument that followed threw the whole house into chaos. Austin was cursing. Eleanor was screaming. Chloe was crying. And Brian was shouting as if trying to drown everything out. But I didn't say another word. I backed out of the room, walked straight into the kitchen, and sat on the bar stool I usually used. Outside the room, the noise was still deafening. Meanwhile, inside my head, all the pieces from the last few months began locking together on their own, fitting so perfectly it was terrifying. The late-night texts, the illogical defense, the averted gazes, holding hands in the side yard. The secret money transfers, they were no longer isolated dots. That night, when everything finally quieted down, I sat alone in the dark. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the pain of a woman being betrayed for the first time. I just felt my mind was clearer than ever. I had no more doubts. The only thing I lacked was hard evidence. And if God had let me know this much, then I would get the rest with my own two hands. And fortunately, from the moment I stood inside the closet that afternoon, acting on pure instinct, I had done the most important thing. When I heard the bedroom door open, when I saw Brian hugging Chloe right in front of my eyes, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my iPhone. But right in the middle of that shock, I pressed the record button. Not because I was a genius, but because at that moment, I understood one thing perfectly. If I jumped out and confronted them right then, at best I'd get denials, a few fake tears, and ultimately, I'd be branded the troublemaker. But if I could capture what was happening right in front of me, no matter how smoothly they lied later, they couldn't erase it. I had stood inside the closet, holding my breath, recording the entire scene of Chloe leaning on Brian's shoulder. The scene of him stroking her hair. The scene of them talking in that soft tone reserved only for people who are incredibly intimate. The video wasn't long, but it was clear enough. So clear that watching it even once made my heart run ice cold again. Only after they left the room did I step out, fix my clothes, put my phone in my purse, and go down to the kitchen, as if nothing had happened. Right then, I knew I couldn't be reckless. That night, I still prepared dinner as usual. I set out the plates and silverware, reheated the salmon that had gone cold, and sat at the dining table like a perfectly normal wife. Maybe it was exactly that calmness that made Brian suspicious. During dinner, he occasionally shot me an inquiring look, while I acted even softer than usual. I deliberately served my mother-in-law her food and made small talk with Chloe when she came over to crash on our couch, as usual. My normal behavior made it impossible for the two of them to guess what was on my mind. Just as we were finishing dinner, Brian finally asked, "You're acting pretty casual about coming home early today." I set my bowl down, looked at him, and answered with one sentence. "Yeah, I came home early so I could see if there were any surprises." The moment my sentence ended, Brian's hand, which was holding his fork, stopped midair. It was just a fraction of a second, but I saw it clearly. Chloe, sitting next to him, also looked down. Hearing that, her fingers gripped the edge of her chair tightly. No one spoke again, but the ensuing silence only convinced me further that they were completely guilty. In the days that followed, I changed my strategy. I stopped acting jealous. I stopped making sarcastic comments. I also didn't bring up the money transferred to Chloe. Let alone that afternoon in the closet. I chose the hardest path for a betrayed woman. Silence. Silence to watch, silence to listen, silence to wait for them to expose themselves even more. Sometimes, while washing dishes and hearing Brian and Chloe's low laughter in the living room, my heart still stung. But I swallowed it down. I knew if I lost my cool now, all I had was one video and a pile of suspicions. I needed more than that. I started paying attention to Brian's phone. One night, while he was in the shower, I took the opportunity to check it. But what I found actually made me feel even colder and more lucid. There was barely a single text between him and Chloe. The call log was completely wiped clean. Deleted so thoroughly that not a single trace was left. It was exactly that excessive cleanliness that was the clearest proof this wasn't the first time they were hiding things. Innocent people don't need to scrub their phones that clean. I set his phone back down, my heart was as cold as ice. Turns out, the two of them weren't just having an affair, they were being incredibly careful about it. From that day on, my acting got much better. I intentionally showed that I completely trusted Brian. One day, in front of my mother-in-law, I even mentioned that work had been insanely busy lately, and that it was a good thing Chloe came over so the house wasn't too quiet. After I said that, Chloe herself looked at me with confusion. Maybe she couldn't understand why someone who was previously so cynical could change so fast. But shortly after, she felt safe again. Because people like Chloe generally only believe in things that benefit them. Seeing me step back, she thought I was scared. Seeing me stay quiet, she thought I was stupid. At the same time, I secretly reached out to an old friend named Ryan. We used to work at the same corporate office, but now he worked in IT and cybersecurity. I didn't tell him all my family drama, just briefly said I needed to recover deleted text messages from an iPhone backup and needed to know how to trace irregular bank transactions. Ryan didn't ask many questions. He just told me to send whatever iCloud backups or data I could pull. He would handle the rest. From that point on, I knew I had stepped into a new chapter. I was no longer the woman sitting in the dark, nursing her suspicions. I was no longer the person standing in the kitchen letting others trample all over my pride. Brian and Chloe might have thought they were stringing me along in their little play. But no, from this moment on, I was the one writing the next scene. I was no longer the passive party, but the one holding the script. Ever since I asked Ryan for help, I lived in a bizarre state. During the day, I went to work, laughed with my coworkers, acting as if nothing was wrong. At night, I still cooked, cleaned the house, and played the role of a normal wife. To the point where I sometimes freaked myself out. But as soon as the bedroom door closed or when the house was dead silent, I would sit alone with my phone, waiting for every tiny signal like a person waiting for a verdict to drop. I knew that once I walked down this road, sooner or later, I would see everything I no longer wanted to believe. 2 days later, Ryan called me. Right from the start, his voice was low. As if he already figured out this wasn't a simple issue. Ryan said, the data on Brian's phone was scrubbed pretty well, but that doesn't mean it's untraceable. Some messages were completely gone, but a good chunk was recovered from memory caches and iCloud sync backups. I stood on the balcony of my office building taking the call. My hand gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. When Ryan sent the file over, I didn't even dare to open it right away. I stood there for a very long time before I was calm enough to click it. The very first lines that popped up on the screen were enough to make my throat tighten. These weren't the comforting texts I used to trick myself into believing they were. This was the language of people who had crossed the line a long time ago. There was a text from Chloe. Brian, don't leave me. I'm only staying with Austin because of you. That one short sentence alone felt like a hammer smashing into my skull. So the poor sister-in-law act wasn't just a recent thing. She had been playing that role long enough to have the nerve to say something like that. Long enough for my husband to let her believe she could make demands. I scrolled down. The more I read, the colder I felt. Fragmented, out-of-order texts, but enough to show their relationship wasn't just sneaky meetups, it was an affair that had been going on for quite a while. They made plans to meet up with shocking intimacy. Speaking with a tone that, if an outsider saw, they would never guess it was a brother and sister-in-law. I sat at my office desk, eyes glued to the screen until they burned. There was a text from Brian. Don't worry, I'll take care of everything. Further down, Chloe replied, you promised. Don't make me wait for nothing. The more I read, the more I understood how deeply I had been played. But that wasn't even all. When Ryan sent the transaction summary he managed to match from the phone and old bank email notifications, I realized this whole mess was much more rotten than I thought. It wasn't just that one massive transfer I found the other day. Over the course of nearly 6 months, Brian had transferred money to Chloe multiple times. Sometimes a few $100s, sometimes thousands. Sometimes just days apart. Every time, the memo was incredibly vague. Groceries, emergency funds, loan, reimbursement. But buried in that pile of transactions was one that made me go dead silent. Joint investment. Joint investment with who? What investment? Why would a married man take his family's money to make a joint investment with his brother's wife? The questions kept looping in my head like a ticking clock against my temples. That was when I realized something even more terrifying than the infidelity itself. Between them, it wasn't just emotional and physical, there was calculation. And when a dirty affair starts mixing with money, it doesn't just stop at standard betrayal. That night, when I got home, I had to act even better. I couldn't let Brian or Chloe see that I had a new hand of cards. I even deliberately sat next to my husband, speaking in a completely normal tone. "Hey, I think I'm gonna head over to my parents' house for a few days this weekend. Mom's been complaining about her back pain, and I haven't been there in a while." Brian, who was looking at his phone, immediately snapped his head up way too fast and asked, "For how many days?" I answered casually, "Maybe 2 or 3. He nodded, trying to look nonchalant, but the brief flash of excitement in his eyes couldn't escape my notice. I just smiled faintly to myself. It's so true. Some things just require giving them a little bit of rope. They'll show their true colors instantly. But I didn't actually go to my parents' house. The next morning, I packed my weekender bag and left the house as usual, even calling my mom to give her a heads up. If Brian asked, tell him I was running errands. After that, I crashed at an empty condo owned by a coworker, not far from my house. I also hired someone Ryan knew to keep an eye on whoever went in and out of my house for those 2 days. More importantly, before leaving, I had hidden 2 tiny voice recorders in the living room, and in the corner of the kitchen hidden well enough that no one would notice them. Those 2 days felt like 2 months. During the day, I worked with my mind drifting back to the house. At night in the empty condo, I opened my phone to check the reports, then sat listening to every audio file. On the second night, while replaying a recording that captured the sound of a chair scraping and glasses clinking, I suddenly heard Chloe's voice clearly. Soft, but no longer with her usual sad tone. She asked directly, "When are you going to divorce Rachel?" My heart felt like it was being crushed. I immediately sat up straight, not daring to breathe. Then Brian's voice came through, low, firm, and terrifyingly cold. "We have to take it slow. The assets are still in her name." With just that one sentence, my ears rang, and my hands shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. All the puzzle pieces from the last few months finally locked together into a complete picture, dirtier and crueler than I ever imagined. They weren't just sleeping together behind my back. They weren't just using the mask of sympathy to trick me. They were plotting. Waiting for the right time, waiting until they could strip me of everything I owned. I sat in that dark room for a very long time. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I no longer felt the sharp, sudden pain. That pain had passed, replaced by something else. Something colder, sharper, and far more lucid. I stared at the phone screen still lit up in the dark, listened to that sentence one more time, and slowly turned it off. That was when I knew I had crossed the absolute final line of my own compassion. I didn't feel hurt anymore. I just felt cold. The ice in my veins after hearing that recording didn't keep me awake. It made me infinitely more aware. I knew perfectly well that if I confronted them with all this evidence right now, at most Brian would deny it, Chloe would cry, and my mother-in-law would once again blame my jealous wife syndrome. I had the proof, but I wasn't going to play my hand just yet. I didn't just want them to admit their mistakes. I wanted their own greed to back them into a corner from which they could never return. The next morning, I went to work as usual. But that evening, the moment I walked into the house, I purposely started a conversation with Brian in a very light, casual tone. As if there wasn't a single ripple of emotion in my heart. I said, "Brian, I've been thinking. As a married couple, we should probably streamline our assets. If all the paperwork is just in my name, it might be a hassle if anything happens. What if we get some of the properties and accounts put under both our names, so we're set for the long term?" The second I finished speaking, Brian, who was taking off his watch, snapped his head up. His reaction was too fast. Fast enough that in an instant, I knew my bait had landed perfectly. He stared at me for a few seconds, then smiled. A forced smile trying to look natural, but his eyes were practically gleaming. He answered almost immediately, "I was actually meaning to talk to you about that. We're husband and wife. Having everything under both our names is just smarter." I sat on the edge of the sofa, calm on the outside, but inside, I was smiling coldly. "I was actually meaning to talk to you about that." A phrase that sounded warm, but to me, it was just his mask slipping halfway down. All this time, whenever I brought up the deeds to the house or the accounts, Brian always changed the subject or said later. But today, the second I opened my mouth, he lunged for it like a drowning man, finding a life preserver. If he didn't have bad intentions from the start, there was no way he'd be that eager. But I wasn't done. I pretended to hesitate for a second, then continued, acting like this was something I was seriously considering. There's one more thing. Lately, some people at the firm have been asking me to get in on a new real estate investment project. I was thinking, if we want to pull a large sum of cash for an investment, we should probably get our paperwork sorted out first so there aren't any legal holdups later. I said it while looking down, smoothing out the edge of my blouse. Not making direct eye contact. But I knew exactly that every word leaving my mouth was like pouring gasoline on a fire. Brian stayed quiet for a second, then asked very quietly, "How large of a sum?" I answered casually. "Pretty massive. If we do it, we might have to use our entire joint savings." He nodded, pretending to weigh the options, but the corners of his mouth were tense. I knew that kind of silence. That wasn't consideration, that was calculation. That night, Brian acted incredibly bizarre. So much so that an outsider would think he was husband of the year. After dinner, he proactively washed the dishes, asked about my day at work, and then said, "If you think it's a solid opportunity, go for it. I always support you." The more I listened, the more nauseous I felt. That night, I didn't go to sleep right away. I lay facing away from him, faking steady breathing, but my mind was waiting. And sure enough, around midnight, his phone buzzed. Very quietly, he pushed the comforter aside, got up, and walked out to the balcony. I didn't move, I just held my breath and listened. His voice was very low, impossible to make out clearly, but his tone wasn't like he was listening to someone vent. It was fast, clipped, like someone discussing urgent business. When he slipped back into bed, even though he was tiptoeing, I could still catch the faint smell of cigarette smoke on his shirt. Brian only smoked when he was scheming something huge. The next morning, I pushed things even further. I purposely sat in the living room and called a friend who worked at a notary's office. I spoke loud enough for the people in the kitchen and the backyard to hear. I said, "Yeah, I might swing by this week to look over a draft for a power of attorney and the joint ownership docs. I just need to be careful. I don't want to sign anything and end up legally liable for a mess." I intentionally emphasized the words legally liable and sign anything exactly when I knew Chloe was folding laundry on the patio. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, as I walked past the kitchen, I saw Chloe walk in looking for my mother-in-law, her eyes constantly darting toward the living room. Her face was no longer the aloof mask from a few days ago, it was pure, poorly hidden anxiety. That afternoon, while I was pretending to run to the grocery store, Ryan's guy gave me a very valuable piece of intel. Chloe secretly met up with Brian at the end of the cul-de-sac. They spoke rapidly, but it was enough to catch one sentence from Chloe. "We have to hurry, Brian. An opportunity like this won't come twice." Hearing that report while sitting at a Starbucks drive-thru, I almost laughed. Turns out, the second people smell money, their true nature reveals itself so quickly. That night, I quietly prepped my next move. Thanks to a recommendation from Ryan, I met with a lawyer specializing in civil contracts. I wasn't doing anything illegal. I just asked them to draft a set of investment contracts and an asset agreement that looked perfectly formal and legally binding on the surface. But buried inside, I inserted extremely airtight clauses. If the signing party is proven to have committed fraud, concealed personal conflicts of interest, or misused joint assets, any generated profits would immediately be voided, and they would be liable for massive financial damages. I read every line carefully and smiled. No matter how huge their greed was, I would let that very greed become the noose around their necks. 2 days later, I purposely announced in front of the whole family that this weekend, I wanted everyone to sit down and have an open discussion about the family finances, just to clear the air. Hearing that, Eleanor nodded in agreement. Now that's the right way to do things. Brian played it cool, but his eyes betrayed his impatience. Meanwhile, Chloe, though sitting in the corner acting like it had nothing to do with her, tensed her neck and blinked rapidly every time the words paperwork or investments were mentioned. I saw it all, noted it all, but didn't say anything else. I hadn't shown my cards yet. I was just letting out the slack on the line, an inch at a time. Just enough to make them see the cash dangling in front of them, make them impatient, and force them to push each other to move faster. Because from the very beginning, I didn't want to trap them with my own strength. I wanted their own lust for money to make them walk willingly into the snare. And I knew that moment was incredibly close. Ever since the night I suggested the open financial talk, the vibe in the house became extremely uncomfortable. It was as if there was a ticking time bomb buried under the floorboards and nobody knew when it would detonate. On the surface, everything looked the same. Eleanor was still bustling in and out, making her passive-aggressive remarks. Brian still ate dinner on time. Chloe still came over with her gloomy face. But if you paid attention, everyone was on edge. Nobody was acting naturally anymore. Especially Brian and Chloe. I noticed Brian becoming much more guarded. His phone wasn't left lying around on the counter anymore, it was permanently glued to his pocket. Sometimes, while we were sitting having a drink, if his phone buzzed even slightly, he'd immediately stand up and walk out to the backyard. Chloe, too, no longer dared to sit blatantly close to Brian, but their eye contact became even more glaring. All Brian had to do was clear his throat or stand up, and Chloe's eyes would instantly track him. That kind of evasive behavior wasn't the behavior of two innocent people. It was the behavior of people who knew someone was starting to suspect them. And that someone was none other than Austin. After being shoved by Brian protecting Chloe, the ego of a guy like Austin was definitely bruised. He no longer saw this as just standard blind jealousy. He started looking deeper. Before, Austin probably just suspected his wife was fooling around with some random guy out there. He probably never dared to think that the person he needed to watch out for was his own flesh and blood brother. But once that seed of suspicion was planted in his head, it grew incredibly fast. I saw the change in Austin clearly. He stopped screaming and shouting when he was mad. Instead, he became quiet, more observant. One day, when Chloe stepped out to the driveway to take a call, I saw Austin standing at the edge of the lawn. Silent, just glaring daggers at his wife's back. Another afternoon, while I was getting the mail, I heard the sound of a truck idling at the end of the street. It turned out Austin hadn't gone to work like he said he did. He had parked his truck hidden behind some trees across the street. His eyes were locked on our house. He had seriously started watching her. What was bound to happen, finally happened. One night around 9:00 p.m., Chloe was sitting in the corner of the kitchen texting, thinking nobody was watching. But Austin appeared out of nowhere, moving dead silent, and stood right behind her. From the living room, I heard Austin's low growl. "Who the hell are you texting that you have to hide it like that?" Then came the sound of a bar stool being violently shoved and a phone being snatched. I didn't need to walk in to picture what was happening. Chloe screamed, and Austin roared like thunder. In a matter of seconds, the whole house was in an uproar. When I walked into the kitchen, Chloe's phone was in Austin's hand. His face was beet red, his jaw clenched tight. Chloe, looking pale as a ghost, tried desperately to snatch it back, but failed. Austin saw something on the screen, then snapped his head up, his eyes filled with fury and humiliation. He might not have found hard proof. Maybe just deleted message threads or vague digital footprints, but it was enough to make the suspicion in his head erupt into a raging fire. "What is this? Huh? Why are you texting my brother at this hour?" Austin bellowed. Chloe was shaking, but quickly threw on the mask she always wore. She wailed, sobbing loudly. "If you don't trust me, then fine. I've suffered enough living like this. Every single day you check my phone, every day you're paranoid. If you want me dead, just say it." That was Chloe's superpower. She always knew exactly when to cry to turn herself into the victim. Her crying had barely subsided when Brian walked in from the garage. I didn't know how much he had heard, but the speed at which he jumped between Austin and Chloe made me want to laugh cynically. He grabbed Austin's arm, his voice booming. "Stop it. If you have a problem, talk it out. Real tough guy. Putting your hands on a woman." Austin turned to his brother. His glare looked like he wanted to eat him alive. "Don't defend her. You're the one who needs to start explaining." He practically growled every word. And I knew, right then, that the conflict between these two brothers had reached a point of no return. My mother-in-law ran in to break it up, playing the same old tune. Blaming Austin for acting crazy, pitying Chloe for suffering, and praising Brian for being a good guy who stood up for her. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Austin wasn't just being reckless anymore. He stared straight into his brother's face with undisguised suspicion. Meanwhile, Brian, though still playing innocent out loud, looked increasingly panicked. Only Chloe was crying a river, looking so pathetic that an outsider might actually feel sorry for her. As for me, I stood in the corner, watching and listening to it all. Suddenly feeling incredibly calm. I realized that filthy relationship had already started destroying itself. Without me needing to do much, just one touch in the right spot, and the whole thing would blow up. And I knew I had to be the one to give it that gentle push. The next morning, as Austin sat on the porch smoking, his face looking hollow from lack of sleep, I deliberately brought him a glass of ice water and set it in front of him. I didn't bring up last night's drama immediately. I just sat down, let out a tired sigh as if I was exhausted too, and then said aimlessly, "Honestly, there are things I don't even know if I should tell you or not. Austin whipped his head toward me. Exactly as I predicted, he was so starved for the truth that he would lunge at even the smallest crumb. I stayed quiet for a few seconds, then continued in a low voice. Don't get mad at me for meddling, but lately, Brian has been giving Chloe a lot of money. I assumed you already knew. With just that one sentence, Austin's face completely transformed. He didn't say a word, but his hand gripped his cigarette so hard it snapped in half. His gaze, which had been cloudy with anger, turned much darker, much sharper. This time, his suspicion was aimed squarely at the right target. I stood up without saying anything else. There are things you don't need to over-explain. Dropping one sentence is enough for a paranoid person to connect the remaining dots using their own bruised ego and shame. As I walked back into the house, I heard the sound of the patio chair being shoved violently behind me. I didn't look back. I just smiled slightly. Because right then, I knew one thing for certain. I didn't need to destroy them anymore. They were going to destroy each other. Ever since I dropped that bomb on Austin on the porch, everything in this house shifted into overdrive, like an engine suddenly kicked into high gear. I saw the changes clearly in everyone. Brian wasn't just on guard anymore, he was getting antsy. Chloe dropped her pathetic, innocent act, replacing it with a constant, paranoid stare, as if waiting for the glass to shatter. And Austin, the guy who used to just yell and throw fits, morphed into a terrifying kind of quiet. He stopped talking, but his dead silence made everyone else sick with anxiety. As for me, I knew it was time for the final act. I had almost everything I needed. The video from the bedroom, the audio recording of Brian and Chloe plotting for my assets, the bank transfer receipts, the recovered text messages, plus the recent hidden audio recordings from the living room. I sat alone in my bedroom, laying everything out in front of me. I listened to every recording again, flagged the crucial timestamps, and jotted down the dates on a notepad. I couldn't afford to be sloppy. Because I knew that to blow this wide open once and for all, I couldn't rely on emotion. I needed evidence, a timeline, and a knockout punch that would leave them zero room for denial. And it felt like God had hand-delivered the perfect opportunity. The coming weekend was the annual summer family reunion barbecue. Every year, the house was packed. Uncles, aunts, cousins from all over the extended family would be there. It was the kind of family gathering where a single piece of gossip was enough to spread through the entire bloodline in one afternoon. I didn't need to look for another venue. Their own family reunion barbecue was going to be the absolute perfect stage to rip off every mask they were wearing. That night at dinner, I purposely spoke in a tone so calm it even caught Eleanor off guard. I said, "I've thought about it. After the family barbecue this weekend, I think I'm going to head to the lawyer's office and start the paperwork to transfer the house and assets into both my name and Brian's. It'll just be easier. We're married for life anyway, so what's the difference?" The second I finished, Brian's fork stopped midair. It was lightning fast, but I caught it. Eleanor actually looked up, a flash of surprise crossing her face before settling into smug satisfaction. She cleared her throat and said in a sickly sweet tone, "Now that's a woman who knows her place. The husband is the head of the household, it's better to leave it to him than trying to control it all yourself." I looked down at my plate, scooping up some mashed potatoes as if nothing had happened. But across from me, Chloe sat frozen. Just from a side glance, I could see her neck turning red, her eyes blinking rapidly. She didn't dare look at me, but her fingers gripped her spoon so tightly her knuckles went white. Her horrible poker face was actually hilarious. It obviously had nothing to do with my family assets, but she was the one practically vibrating with impatience. From that day on, Brian and Chloe couldn't hide their desperation. They literally couldn't wait. My private investigator reported that in just 2 days, they met up 3 times at the end of the street and at a Starbucks near the mall. These weren't venting sessions anymore, they were rushed, panic check-ins. Talk quickly, then leave separately. That night, the audio recorder I planted in the living room handed me another piece of the puzzle. The more I listened, the more I realized that greed makes people incredibly sloppy. At one point, Chloe's voice came through, low, but desperate. "What if Rachel finds out?" I sat in the dark, my AirPods jammed into my ears so hard they hurt. But I could still hear my own heartbeat clearly. Then Brian's voice replied, low, firm, and terrifyingly cold. "She won't find out. She's stupid." With just that one sentence, I had to pull my AirPods out, set the phone on my nightstand, and sit perfectly still for a long time. I thought I wouldn't feel any more pain over this man. But it turns out there are words that don't make you cry, they just make you feel like your entire worth is being stomped into the dirt. Stupid. So after years of building a life together, in the eyes of the man who shared my bed, I was just a stupid woman. Easy to manipulate, easy to fool. Easy to rob blind, and then throw away. That sentence killed any lingering hesitation I had. If I had any doubts about making a scene at the family barbecue, that audio clip wiped them out. I had absolutely zero regrets left. I wasn't the one destroying their family, they had destroyed it a long time ago. At the same time, Austin wasn't sitting idle. Ever since I dropped that hint, he had been secretly tailing Chloe almost every day. One afternoon, she came home late and acted like nothing happened. But I clearly saw his truck parked, hidden behind the large oak trees at the entrance of our subdivision. One night, he even stood in the front yard for a long time, staring dead at the living room window where Brian had just stepped out to take a call. Austin wasn't throwing blind tantrums anymore, and that's what made him dangerous. When a guy who only knows how to throw punches goes dead silent and starts observing, it means he already knows deep down that something incredibly filthy is going on. I knew it was time to meet with him privately. Not to spill everything, but to push him right to the edge of the cliff. The evening before the barbecue, I asked Austin to meet me at a diner on the edge of town, timing it so it was getting dark and nobody we knew would be around. He stared at me, his look a mix of suspicion and aggressive impatience. I didn't beat around the bush. I pulled out my phone and played a short audio clip for him. Just the part where Chloe asks, "When are you going to divorce Rachel?" And Brian's reply about the assets. I didn't show him the video, didn't hand over the bank statements, and didn't tell him everything I knew. After hearing it, Austin's face went chalk white, then flushed dark red in a second. He stood up so fast his chair tipped over backwards. His jaw locked so tight I swear I could hear his teeth grinding. "Give me everything you have," he growled. I sat there, staring straight back at him. "Not yet." Austin leaned in, his hands gripping the diner table like he wanted to snap it in half. "What the hell are you waiting for, Rachel? They've been sleeping together behind my back." I answered very quietly, pronouncing every single word. "If you want the whole truth, wait for the barbecue tomorrow." He froze. The rage in his eyes was still burning, but I knew he was listening. I continued, my voice low and cold. "If you blow this up right now, at best they'll just deny it again. You'll throw a punch, and you'll still be the one looking like the crazy, jealous idiot. But if we do this at the right time, in the right place, in front of the entire extended family, neither of them will have anywhere to run." Austin breathed heavily, his chest heaving, then he gritted his teeth and gave a single, hard nod. That one nod was enough. I knew that starting right now, every chess piece was exactly where it needed to be. That night, I went home, locked my bedroom door, and organized everything for the final time. The phone, the audio files, the video, the printed texts, and even the names of 2 people who could act as witnesses if necessary. I stayed up late arranging the order of the evidence, planning exactly what to say first, when to pause, and which recording to play when. I was no longer a betrayed woman crying into my pillow. I was producing a show where they would all be stripped bare by the truth itself. Outside, the wind rustled through the oak trees. Inside the house, everyone still thought tomorrow was just another family barbecue. I was the only one who knew that tomorrow was the day everything ended. I locked my phone screen, sat in the dark for a moment, and said to myself, word by word, "This time, there is no going back for anyone." The next morning, the house was packed before the sun was even fully up. Relatives from near and far, aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone rolled in. The sound of greetings, the clinking of plates, and people setting up the folding tables made the backyard sound festive, but my heart was as calm as a placid lake. I woke up early, picked out a tasteful, dark navy sundress, pinned my hair up neatly, and put on just enough makeup to hide any exhaustion. People think women tremble when they're about to do something massive. But at that point, I had absolutely nothing left to fear. I purposely helped set up the buffet spread, poured the iced tea, and arranged the cups, speaking even softer than usual. It was exactly that eerie calm that made Brian and Chloe lower their guard. I saw it clearly. Brian shot me a few looks, trying to read my mind. But when he saw I wasn't bringing anything up, that I was being polite to his aunts and setting up lawn chairs, his face relaxed. Meanwhile, Chloe barely dared to look at me all morning. She kept busy in the kitchen, but her hands were so shaky that she actually spilled a pitcher of lemonade while carrying it. Eleanor, on the other hand, seeing me acting so obedient and knowing my place, let her ego inflate even further. While standing on the patio chatting with a few aunts, she deliberately raised her voice so I would hear. "You see the difference in a woman who knows how to be patient, who knows how to keep a home. If you just scream and shout, You ruin the marriage and become the neighborhood joke. A few people around her nodded in agreement. Some even looked my way and smiled, as if praising me for finally waking up. I, who happened to be walking by with a tray of cups, stopped for a second and replied very softly. Yes, Eleanor. I was actually thinking that there are some things that are best explained when the whole family is gathered together like this. After saying that, I just walked away without looking back. But I knew that sentence made at least 3 people on that patio freeze. Brian stared at me. Chloe went pale. And Austin, standing at the edge of the yard, took a deep drag of his cigarette and crushed it into the pavement. The family toast went exactly as usual. Everyone raised a glass, the food was laid out, and the uncles spoke fondly about their late grandfather. I stood in the back, holding my glass, but my heart was ice cold. If he were still alive and saw his grandsons today, he probably never would have imagined this family barbecue would turn into this. But precisely because it was a family reunion, precisely because the entire bloodline was here to witness it, I couldn't back down. After the toast, people started hitting the buffet line. The sound of chairs scraping, kids running around, and adults chatting made things a bit noisy. And right at that moment, I stood up. I didn't need to clink a glass or shout. Just by standing in the middle of the patio, holding a stack of papers, the noise slowly died down. I looked around, waiting until every single eye was on me, before I started speaking. I'd like to ask for everyone's attention regarding some family and financial matters today. In front of all the aunts, uncles, and the entire extended family, I want you all to be my witnesses. Hearing the word financial, several people looked up. They probably all thought I was going to announce transferring the deeds into Brian's name, just like I hinted a few days ago. Eleanor even cleared her throat and sat up straighter. Brian smiled slightly, trying to look cool, but his eyes were full of anticipation. I gently gripped the stack of papers in my hand, then said, articulating every word. I once thought that my money and assets could safely be handed over to my husband. But before we get to that, I need to clarify one thing. Does this man even deserve to be called a husband? The entire backyard froze. The scraping chairs stopped, the talking ceased. I could even hear someone gently setting their solo cup down on a table nearby. Brian was the first to react. He let out an awkward, nervous laugh, trying to make it sound like I was being ridiculous. Rachel, what's gotten into you? Today is a family reunion, don't start drama. I looked dead into his eyes. There wasn't a single tremor in my body. Start drama? Do you really think my drama could ever top the show you guys have been putting on? The second that sentence left my mouth, I unlocked my phone and hit play on the first audio file. A faint static sound played, then Chloe's voice echoed crystal clear across the patio. When are you going to divorce Rachel? Followed by Brian's low, cold voice. We have to take it slow. The assets are still in her name. With just that short clip, the aunts sitting closest to me dropped their jaws. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Eleanor turned to stone. Brian wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes were bulging, unable to believe I actually had the nerve to play it at a family gathering. Chloe was the first to jump up. Her face was chalk white, her voice shrill with panic. No. That's not true. You edited that, you're framing me. I turned to her, watching her trembling lips, and replied sharply. Framing you? Your voice sounds pretty authentic to me. Or do I need to play the video of you in my master bedroom so the whole family can see it? The moment that dropped, it was like a bucket of ice water over the entire yard. Several people whipped their heads toward Chloe. Their looks shifted from shock to absolute disgust. Right at that exact second crash, Austin slammed his beer bottle onto the table. Glass shattered, his face was violently red, the veins in his neck popping. He pointed directly at Chloe and roared. You lying bitch. Answer me. Have you been screwing my brother? But before Austin could even lunge at her, Brian was already on his feet, stepping in front to protect Chloe with an instinctive reflex that an innocent brother-in-law would never possess. That single action silenced the crowd even more. Nobody thought this was a misunderstanding anymore. I stood completely still. The phone still lit up in my hand. Scanning the faces around me, I hadn't shown the video yet. I hadn't pulled out the bank receipts. I hadn't played the more damning audio. I had only ripped off the very first layer of their masks. But I knew it was enough to make the entire extended family realize one thing. This barbecue wasn't a reunion anymore. It had turned into a public tribunal, and none of them could just sit and eat potato salad like nothing was happening. As soon as I looked away from the frozen faces, everything exploded exactly as I predicted. Austin lost his mind. He kicked a chair out of the way and charged at Brian like a cornered animal. The sound of his boots hitting the deck was loud, followed immediately by a sickening punch that landed squarely on his own brother's jaw. It was so hard I heard the crack. Brian stumbled backward, his lower back slamming against the edge of the picnic table. His lip split open, blood instantly trickling down his chin. Austin growled, his voice completely hoarse with rage. "You're my own flesh and blood. And you're sleeping with my wife?" That sentence hung in the air, and the yard fell into dead silence again. Kids were yanked into the corners by their parents. Several aunts grabbed their chests and stood up. The uncles rushed forward, terrified the brothers were going to tear each other apart and wreck the whole event. But Austin's rage wasn't his usual blind jealousy anymore. This was the pure humiliation of a man being emasculated in front of his entire bloodline. But what shocked everyone the most wasn't the punch. It was Chloe's reaction. She didn't run to her husband. She didn't try to hold Austin back like a wife terrified her man was going to do something crazy, let alone cry and beg like an innocent victim. Instead, she shrieked and ran straight to Brian. The frantic way she touched Brian's shoulder, propping him up. The way she leaned in and asked, "Brian, are you okay?" It felt like a collective slap to the face of every family member standing there. An older great-aunt standing near the food table muttered, "Jesus Christ, so it's true." With just that one action, the last layer of their cover was blown wide open. However, the person who disgusted me the most was Eleanor. In the middle of a scene where her oldest son was bleeding, her youngest was losing his mind, and her daughter-in-law was clinging to her brother-in-law, she didn't step up to slap Chloe. She didn't demand the truth. The very first thing she did was point her finger dead at my face and scream. Her eyes were bulging, her lips quivering, her voice shrill. You deliberately started this drama at a family reunion to drag our family name through the mud." Hearing that, I let out a cold laugh. Even now, all she cared about was her reputation. I stared right back at her and said one sentence. "Am I dragging your name through the mud, or did your own sons do that for you?" The moment I said it, several relatives turned to look at Eleanor. Their expressions were already shifting. Brian, meanwhile, was leaning against the table, wiping the blood from his mouth, still trying to spin it. He looked around at everyone, pointing at Chloe, his voice shaky but still trying to play the hero. "Everyone, don't just listen to Rachel. This is because of Chloe." I only felt sorry for her because Austin was beating her and abusing her, so I had a moment of weakness. Hearing that, I knew if I let him keep talking, he'd try to blame the whole affair on a woman's fragility and his own noble pity. I didn't give him the chance to finish his performance. I grabbed the second phone I had prepped, tossed it into the middle of the table, and hit play on the video. The screen lit up for the whole yard to see. Even in the daylight, the footage from inside the master bedroom was crystal clear. The entire family watched Brian open the door. Chloe followed him in. Then Brian himself wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her close. Just seeing that, some people looked away in disgust, but I let the video keep playing. Brian stroked Chloe's hair, leaned down, and kissed her forehead, while Chloe melted into his chest like a woman completely used to being pampered by him. There was nothing left to deny. No more stories about pity, being seduced, or being tricked. The truth was playing on the screen, naked and humiliating, right in front of the family gathering. Eleanor stared at the phone. Her face went gray, her usually sharp mouth trembling without a single sound coming out. Austin, seeing the video, went totally berserk. He ripped himself out of his uncle's grip and lunged to choke Chloe. His hands clamped down so hard her face turned purple in seconds. It took 3 grown men to pry him off and pin him down. Chloe, after coughing violently, went right back to her old playbook. She wailed and sobbed as if she were the biggest victim in the yard. But this time, in her absolute panic, she exposed herself completely. Between sobs, she pointed at Brian. "It wasn't my idea. Brian is the one who said he was going to marry me. He promised he'd get me my own apartment. He was the one who said." Chloe paused for a second, like she was biting her tongue, then just let it all out. "He said Rachel was stiff and stupid because she trusted him too much." The moment she said that, the entire yard felt like a bomb had gone off. I didn't let the stunned silence go to waste. I stepped forward, my voice firm and freezing cold. "Get you your own apartment? With whose money? The money he stole from my joint savings account?" As I said it, I pulled the stack of printed bank statements out of my purse and slammed them down hard on the table. Page after page showing the dates, the amounts, the memos, and the recipient's name. It was all there in black and white. It wasn't just a verbal accusation anymore. A few aunts who had still been on the fence saw the paperwork and were left completely speechless. An uncle sitting in the front row slammed his fist on the table and yelled at Brian, "You son of a bitch. How do you even have the nerve to show your face in front of this family with behavior like that?" From that moment on, the mood in the yard shifted from shock to open disgust. But I knew if I stopped here, I'd be missing the final nail in the coffin for Chloe. Because in the eyes of some people, she could still spin herself as the naive girl manipulated by her older brother-in-law. I wasn't going to give her that out. I unlocked my phone, pulled up the deleted texts Ryan had recovered, and read them loud and clear in front of the entire family. "Brian, hurry up and take care of everything. I can't stand living with Austin anymore. Don't forget about the house, the car, and the money you promised me." After I read it, the yard went dead silent. Nobody was looking at Chloe with pity anymore. The woman sobbing on the ground hadn't just cheated on her husband. She had meticulously planned every step of her exit strategy. Chloe froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Brian's face was ashen. Eleanor slumped down into a lawn chair, her shoulders shaking. Not out of pity, but because for the first time in her life, she had no words left to cover up her family's disgrace. At that moment, in front of the whole family, all their roles were obliterated. There were no victims in their eyes. Brian was a cheating thief, Chloe was an opportunistic gold digger, and Eleanor was the blind mother who enabled the whole degenerate mess. But I knew the biggest explosion was still waiting at the end. I looked around, letting the heavy, suffocating silence press down on every face. That silence was priceless. It's the moment when people are still in shock, before they have time to formulate excuses or spin new lies to save face. I took a step back, rested my hands on the edge of the table, and spoke very quietly, every word driving a nail into the coffin. If this was just an affair, I wouldn't have picked today to speak up. What I want to show you all is that they didn't just sleep together, they plotted to leave me with absolutely nothing. The moment that sentence dropped, the yard erupted into frantic whispers. Relatives looked at each other, some thinking they had misheard. Cheating was dirty enough, but when it came to a premeditated plot to trap someone and steal their assets, that was no longer standard marital drama. That was straight-up fraud, scamming, and blatant robbery from within the family. I didn't let the commotion last long. I opened my purse, pulled out the 2 sets of documents I had prepared, and slapped them down on the table. One set was the fake investment contracts and ownership docs I had baited Brian with a few days ago. The other set were photocopies of the real documents he had secretly taken to a lawyer for a consultation. I laid them side by side, flipped to the right pages, and explained calmly. I baited Brian into thinking that with just one more step, he could have all the deeds in his hands. And just like I predicted, he couldn't wait. Thanks to a contact at the notary's office and a friend who helped check his digital footprint, I know he secretly took our paperwork to ask how to transfer this house solely into his name. Brian's face, which had been gray, turned ghostly white. His eyes blinked rapidly, his hands hanging at his sides clenching into fists. I stared directly at my husband, no longer calling him by any affectionate names. "You forged my signature from old documents. You had someone draft a fake power of attorney. You were just waiting for me to drop my guard, or waiting for me to accidentally sign the wrong paper, so you could finish the job. Am I right?" The whole family reacted like gasoline was poured onto a bonfire. An uncle stood up from his chair, leaning on the table, eyes wide. "My God. You actually went that far?" Brian stuttered. His usual smooth-talking charm was completely gone. "Rachel, who's been putting these lies in your head?" "I haven't done anything." I cut him off instantly, leaving him no room to retreat. "You haven't done it yet because you haven't had the chance. Not because you didn't plan to." As soon as I said that, I played the recording I had listened to 100 times the night before, making sure not a single word was missed. Brian's voice echoed loudly across the yard. So loud that the people sitting at the furthest tables could hear it. "Once the house is in my name, even if she finds out, it'll be too late. When we divorce, I'll just toss her a little cash and that'll be enough." This time, nobody could stay seated. Curses flew from several corners. An older aunt smacked her forehead, yelling, "Lord have mercy," while the uncles glared at Brian like they were looking at a complete stranger. This filthy act wasn't about sex anymore. This was a calculated trap, engineered over months with legal documents and money. Austin, suddenly, didn't try to lunge forward to throw another punch. He stood in the middle of the yard, chest heaving, and then suddenly burst into laughter. A hoarse, bizarre laugh that sounded terrifying. He looked at his own brother, then at his wife. His voice sounded like it was scraping against sandpaper. "Unbelievable. One sleeps with my brother. The other plots to steal his wife's house. I really am the biggest idiot in this family. Right at that moment, Eleanor still tried to save her golden child. She stood up, trembling, her hands gripping the table, trying to sound calm. He was just talking out of anger. Men say stupid things when they're mad. I turned to look at her. My heart was as cold as ice. If she was just blindly defending her son, people might still feel a tiny bit of pity for her. But she wasn't blind. She knew. And I had waited for this exact moment to rip down the final curtain. I pulled out the third phone, playing the security camera footage from the front porch. The angle wasn't super close, but it was clear enough to recognize everyone. Eleanor was seen looking left and right, then slipping a manila folder into Brian's hands. Her voice hissed slightly, but it was unmistakable. Get this done fast. If you drag your feet, it's just gonna cause problems. The second that audio played, the yard fell into absolute, deafening silence. Not even whispers this time. Just total silence. As if they had just heard something entirely incomprehensible. Eleanor froze. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Immediately after, the backlash aimed straight at her. An aunt pointed a finger dead at her, her voice sharp as a whip. You're a mother, and you encouraged your son to steal his wife's property? You are a disgrace. Another uncle shook his head in disgust. This family is rotten to the core. I stood still, staring at Eleanor. For the first time, I saw this woman who was always so abrasive, who loved talking down to people on her moral high horse, trembling in fear in front of the very relatives, whose opinions she valued over everything. But I wasn't letting it end there. Chloe, seeing the tide turn completely, immediately pivoted like a snake trying to save its own skin. She fell to her knees crying, pointing right at Brian. He manipulated me. He promised that after he got the house, he'd open a salon for me. He said we just had to wait a little longer. He also said. Chloe paused, then spit it all out. He said Rachel was rigid and stupid because she trusted her husband too much. The moment she said that, the yard felt like it had been slapped again. Even though I had already heard it on the recording, hearing it said out loud, raw and unfiltered in front of the entire family, still hurt deeply. Not because I was heartbroken over love, but because I had once given my all to a man who thought so little of me. By this point, all three of them, Brian, Chloe, and Eleanor, were completely stripped bare. There were no more excuses left, nowhere to hide, and no dignity remaining to even look their relatives in the eye. But I wasn't finished. I gripped my purse, feeling the final stack of documents inside, and lifted my chin. I knew I had one last move. One move that would push them from simple public humiliation down to a place where they could never stand back up. I looked at the three people standing in front of me. The man who used to be my husband, the woman who used to call me her sister, and the woman who used to lecture me on how to keep a home. And inside my heart, there was no more turmoil. The most terrifying thing about a woman isn't when she cries, or when she screams out of heartbreak. It's when she has cried enough, heard enough, realized enough, and absolutely no longer needs anyone's pity. I slowly reached into my purse, pulled out the final stack of papers, and slammed them down right in front of Brian, dead center on the table. The sound of the heavy envelope hitting the wood was dull. But in that dead silent yard, it sounded like a knife plunging into whatever was left of his ego. I stared straight at Brian, enunciating every word clearly, without raising my voice, without trembling, and without a single lump in my throat. I didn't come here today to ask for sympathy. I came here to show everyone your true colors. After I said that, I pushed the documents slightly toward him. Sign them. The divorce papers. If you sign them today, you get to walk away with a shred of dignity. If you don't, tomorrow morning I hand all of this evidence over to the police on charges of document forgery and attempted grand larceny. That was when I saw a look on Brian's face that could only be described as pure terror. It wasn't the anger he used to cover up his mistakes, nor the fake victim act, nor the scheming look of a guy who thought he could turn the tables. Cheating, to a guy like him, was something he could probably blame on a woman, the situation, or a moment of weakness. But when it came to forged legal documents, deeds, and grand larceny, that was an entirely different ballgame. That was something that could put him away for a long time. Brian's lips quivered. He swallowed hard, then lowered his voice for the first time in forever. It wasn't the voice of an arrogant husband anymore, it was the voice of someone begging for mercy. Rachel. I messed up. Please, just give me one chance. Hearing that sentence made me want to laugh. A chance? This man actually had the audacity to ask for a chance after everything he had done. I stared at him without blinking and answered instantly. I gave you chances for years, and you used them to sleep with your brother's wife and plot to throw me out on the street. The moment I said that, the yard went silent again. Nobody interrupted. Because everyone knew it was true. Dead true. Chloe, standing next to him, who had been hoping to cling to Brian as her way out, saw her final lifeboat sinking. She instantly changed directions, a habit of someone who only survives by latching onto whoever is strongest. She turned to Austin, dropping to her knees in the middle of the patio. Her hair was a mess, tears and snot streaming down her face, her hands grabbing at his jeans. Austin, I was wrong. I made a mistake. Please, just forgive me this one time. But Austin wasn't the guy who just threw tantrums and yelled anymore. After being humiliated in front of his entire family, his stare was terrifyingly hollow. He looked down at Chloe like he was looking at something disgusting and foreign, then said in a hoarse voice, word by word, "You don't need to apologize. As of right now, you are dead to me." The sentence was short, but it was colder than any physical slap. Chloe's hands instantly dropped, as if all the bones in her body had been yanked out. Eleanor, watching her oldest son about to sign divorce papers and her youngest son disown his wife, went into full panic mode. She lunged at the table to snatch the papers. Her mouth no longer cared about her pristine image. She just shrieked. "You! Don't be so ruthless. Are you trying to back your own husband into a corner? You heartless bitch." But before her hands could even touch the paper, an aunt stepped forward and blocked her. The aunt's voice cracked like a whip. "Your daughter-in-law isn't ruthless. You and your son are the ones living like degenerates." Not a single relative stepped up to defend her. Some looked away, some shook their heads, some sighed. For the first time after years of reigning supreme in this family, Eleanor was abandoned by her own bloodline in the middle of her own backyard. I knew it was time to play my final card. The card that even Brian probably never saw coming. I looked at him, then slowly panned to everyone in the yard. My voice remained flat, but sharp as a honed blade. "Oh, right. There's one more thing you probably don't know. 3 days ago, I drained all of our joint checking and savings accounts and moved the money to a new account under my name only. I also filed for a temporary freeze on any transactions regarding this property, and I handed over all the original deeds and paperwork to my lawyer." I paused for a second to let every word sink into their heads, then continued. "In other words, you had absolutely nothing, long before you even thought you won." I saw Brian visibly deflate, as if all the energy had been sucked out of his body. His shoulders slumped, his eyes went blank. The cunning, calculating demeanor he had worn all this time shattered onto the deck. He finally understood. He understood that the entire web he had been secretly spinning for months, from the money to the house, from his wife to his sister-in-law, from the promises to the forged documents, was completely annihilated. The money couldn't be touched. The house couldn't be touched. The sister-in-law he slept with was just disowned by his own brother at his feet. His mother was being openly mocked by the entire family. He thought this was his victory lap. Turns out, I had him locked in a cage before he even took his first step. I looked at him one last time, then concluded in front of everyone. "You thought I was stupid because I stayed quiet. But the most pathetic people are the ones who mistake someone's silence for ignorance." After that sentence left my mouth, I felt like a massive boulder that had been crushing my chest was finally lifted. It wasn't the smug satisfaction of winning, but a feeling of profound peace. It's what happens when someone finally secures justice for themselves. Just as I was reaching for my purse, Austin stepped into the middle of the patio. This time, he didn't punch anyone, didn't curse, and didn't look crazy anymore. He stood in front of me, his eyes still bloodshot, but his voice was hoarse and low. "Rachel, I know I'm a piece of shit. But this time, I am truly sorry. I couldn't keep my wife in check, and I let you get dragged into this mud." I looked at him for a second. This was the first time in my entire life I had ever seen Austin genuinely bow his head. Not out of fear, but because he finally realized how badly he had lived his life. I didn't say I forgave him, nor did I comfort him. I just gave a slow nod. That was enough. Then I picked up my purse, turned around, and walked out of that family's house. Nobody stopped me. Nobody had the right to stop me anymore. Behind me, the house was still standing. The walls were intact, the roof was intact, the photos on the mantel were still there. But I knew perfectly well that the moment I walked past that driveway, whatever they called honor in that backyard had completely and utterly collapsed. After that defining family barbecue, everything ended so fast that I didn't even feel like it dragged on. I guess when the truth is ripped up by its roots, people lose all their reasons to hold on. Brian didn't fight back. He signed the divorce papers quickly, faster than he normally signed his work contracts. But this time, his pen strokes weren't firm. His hand shook slightly. His eyes didn't dare meet mine. Not because there was any love left, but because he knew he had lost. He lost not because I was some mastermind, but because he had driven himself into a dead end. Chloe was thrown out of the house by Austin that very same day. I heard from the neighbors that she stood outside the driveway for a long time, crying until her voice gave out, but Austin never opened the door. That door wasn't closed out of temporary anger. It was closed because the absolute final boundary of a man's patience had been crossed. But life isn't a fairy tale where a cheater just gets welcomed with open arms somewhere else. Brian immediately cut all contact with her too. He didn't dare get involved with her anymore because he was too busy trying to salvage whatever tiny shreds of his reputation were left. Going from someone who thought she was stepping into a luxurious new life, Chloe hit the pavement hard, with absolutely nothing left to cling to. Eleanor wasn't loud and obnoxious anymore. After that incident, she went completely silent. But her silence wasn't out of remorse. It was because she had no face left to show. I heard that at family events after that, whenever she showed up, people didn't greet her warmly. They would just look, turn away, and whisper. For someone who lived her entire life for her ego and social standing, that was probably the harshest punishment of all. Brian lost way more than he ever imagined. Not just his family, but his reputation. The story about him taking documents to a lawyer to forge a deed and the audio recordings of him plotting fraud couldn't be entirely swept under the rug. His career took a hit, his business contacts slowly backed away. People didn't need to say it to his face, but a single guarded look was enough to let him know they no longer trusted him. There are things that, once cracked, can never be put back together. Out of everyone left behind, Austin was the only one who made me think a little. Not out of pity, but because the last time I saw him, I noticed something different in his eyes. The hot temper was gone, the attitude of a guy treating his wife like property was gone. He became quieter, calmer. Maybe after all this, he finally realized one thing. If it hadn't been for his reckless lifestyle, his blind jealousy, and treating his wife like an object, maybe things wouldn't have gone this far. But realizing it doesn't mean everything can go back to how it was. At least he knew where he went wrong. As for me, a lot of people thought I won, but I never felt like I was competing against anyone. I just took back what was rightfully mine. The truth, my assets, my dignity, and most importantly, the right to walk away from a relationship without having to bow my head. It wasn't a loud, cheering victory, but a deep, inner peace, knowing I owed absolutely nothing to anyone. Someone asked me once, after everything, if I still held a grudge. I paused for a second and answered very lightly. I used to hold a grudge, but then I realized that the people who betray each other end up turning their own lives into a prison sentence. Saying that out loud made my heart feel incredibly light. Because when you hold a grudge, you're still chained to the past. But when you can let it go, that's when you truly move forward. I moved to a new condo, not too far away, but far enough that I didn't have to see any of their faces. Every day, I reorganized my career, decorated my new place, and learned to get used to nights without waiting for anyone to come home, without having to guess who was lying to me. At first, it felt a little lonely, but then I realized the silence wasn't as scary as I thought. In fact, it made me feel more alive, more like myself. Only once did Brian come to see me. He stood at my front door. He didn't look as sharp as he used to, his voice was raspy. "I've lost everything." I looked at him for a moment and answered very quietly, "No. What you lost wasn't because I took it from you. It's the receipt for what you chose to trade away." After I said that, I slowly closed the door. Not out of revenge, but to close a chapter of my life that I never wanted to revisit again. Sometimes I still think about what happened, but it doesn't carry that heavy, suffocating weight anymore. I'm not thankful for the trauma, because nobody wants to go through something like that. But I am grateful for the day I was lucid enough to walk away from it. Because out of that wreckage that seemed entirely destroyed, I managed to find myself again.